Welcome back to the Linux Academy Nginx Deep Dive. In the previous video, we generated our own self-signed certificates, and in this video, we're going to change our default server configuration so that we can handle HTTPS connections. To do this, we're going to work from a different module than the core module or the auth basic module that we spent a lot of our time. If we scroll down a little bit more, you can see that there is an SSL module. There are quite a lot of settings that we can use for SSL, and we're going to utilize more of these as we continue on through the course. But in this video, we're going to create the simplest possible SSL configuration that we can do for one of our virtual servers. I do want to call out that the SSL directive is no longer used. The SSL directive is no longer used, and you should instead use it with listen, which we'll do. But for us, the two that are going to be really important are going to be the SSL certificate and then the associated SSL certificate key file. The key file takes the private version, and the SSL certificate directive takes the public version. And you'll notice in the example down here that it can handle multiple different types too. So you can have an RSA version, and then you could also do a different type of encryption for your certificates. We're using RSA, so we only need one pair of SSL certificate and key directives. But the rest of this is actually pretty important. You'll see that we are listening on port 443, which is the default port. That's if you go to HTTPS : any website on the internet, it's going to, by default, connect to port 443. And then we want to utilize SSL. So this is another one of the optional flags that you can pass to the listen directive, similar to how default server worked for us when we were working on port 80. So now that we know we have two directives to work with, the SSL certificate and SSL certificate key, and they both take a file, I think we're ready to go modify our configuration. So from here, we're going to open up the conf.d default.conf. And although we already have a listen directive here, we can add a second one if we want to use the exact same server configuration for both HTTP and HTTPS traffic. So we're going to listen on port 443 using SSL. And then we're going to continue on and add in our SSL certificate, which is going to point to etc nginx SSL, and then we called it public.pem. And then we'll also add an SSL certificate key that goes to etc nginx SSL private.key. And now we can save this. If we run this through nginx-t, we'll see that we didn't have any obvious typos that would cause error. And now we're ready to reload this using systemctl reload nginx. To test this out, using our browser, we can come over here and add an HTTPS in front of our actual public IP. And this is what you're going to see. And it says your connection is not secure. This is considered an error, and that's because we're using a self-signed certificate. To get back from this and actually see the content, you're going to click Advanced. Or if you're using a different browser, you might see something else. But there's going to be something that you can click that can basically get you to add an exception, and then you can confirm the security exception. And that just means in this particular case that we're still using SSL, but the security isn't considered good by the browser because we're using a self-signed certificate. If we go to admin.html, it's still going to prompt us for our username and password. But you'll notice that we continued to use HTTPS, and that worked out just fine. Before we conclude this, I do want to talk about how you could look at this through curl, because if we currently curl HTTPS localhost, you're going to see that it's actually insecure. But thankfully, this error message is pretty useful, and it tells us that if you want to skip the verification of certificates, you can use -k or --insecure. So if we do -k and we connect to HTTPS localhost, you'll see that it actually showed us the default index.html file. index.html page that we've been working with. Just to recap, setting up the simplest possible SSL server required us to use 3 lines. We had to listen on port 443 and specify that we were using SSL for that. And then additionally, we had to specify the certificate to use and the private key associated with that certificate.